Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DeCosta, and this is Preterism. Thank you for joining me. That was the fastest I've ever done my intro. Welcome everybody. It's great to have you. You know, I've been thinking about a new name for the show. What do you guys think of Driving the Point Home with Jason DeCosta? I think it's kind of funny because I'm always driving. You get it? When I'm teaching, I'm driving the point. Forget it. Anyways, how's everybody doing out there today? I've been in a little bit of a video kick, if you couldn't tell. I've got a few out there. And I like to do these when I'm driving, typically on my way to work, on my way from work, whatever's on my mind. I just kind of let it flow like I'm Eminem on 8 Mile, rapping, spilling spaghetti on mom's sweater. Mom's spaghetti on my sweater. Hands, knees weak, palms are sweaty. You know how it goes. But I wanted to just make a quick little video today on Paul's letter to the Colossians and just try to connect some things. Now, I will mention that someone notified me that Derek Lambert made a new Myth Vision video about Israel only, or basically about me and what I say about Jason Staples. And I didn't have time to look at much of it. I've watched about 2 or 3 minutes so far. And it seemed in those 2 or 3 minutes that he was accusing me, Derek was, of making a straw man argument against Dr. Jason Staples. And his argument was something like, well, DeCosta says that, Staples is wrong because he doesn't realize the eschatological nature of the New Testament. And therefore, that's a straw man. Derek, that's nonsense. That is absolutely 100% true. Okay? Every single human being, every single humanoid who does not recognize the eschatological nature of the New Testament and what was coming to an end will miss the entire story. Period. Point blank, over and out. That's all it had to do with. Destruction of the temple and those who would be gathered in prior. That's it. That's the name of the game. That's the whole shebang. Okay? And Matthew 24:14 or 13 and 14 tells you that clearly. Okay? This gospel of the kingdom will go to all nations, and then, one more time, everybody, and then the end will come. The gospel went out before the end came. Now, Derek, any clue when that end was supposed to be? Yes, you know. So therefore, anyone, including Dr. Jason Staples, who refuses to acknowledge the eschatological soon-to-come nature of the New Testament, is radically flawed in their theology. Period. Okay? And so what I'm going to do, I have a little bit of time this weekend, and as you know, I don't like to do these things in my household where my lovely wife is and when she's there, because my wife is kind of a casual Christian, so she believes it. She doesn't really want to hear the deep theological stuff, and that's fine. And she knows my opinion. She knows what I believe. She knows I'm not a Bible believer. She knows I don't believe in Jesus. She knows I'm an Israel only guy, and everything's fine. Our relationship has never ever been better. Imagine that. When I was a wannabe Israelite, I tried to do the whole Christian thing, like, we can't touch each other. Let's wait and let's get married 3 days later. And that kind of thing doesn't work. All right, people might say it works, but trust me, they're miserable for the most part. Okay, now I know there's some happy couples. I'm not saying all couples are miserable, but I've known in my short tenure here on planet Earth, I've known many a Christian couples who have thought that they were doing the right thing, and just because they were both Christians, they shacked up together, they put a ring on it, and it ended up falling to shit. And it happens more than you think. And if it doesn't happen, a lot of times they're miserable, they're unhappy, they're living a cold and lonely life because they realize that they married somebody just for, the sake of being able to say, hey, we agree on Matthew 13:92. It's kind of silly. And I personally went down that road about 10 years ago and learned a huge, huge lesson from it. And I will never do it again. So thankfully, my marriage with my wife is fantastic. So much for that don't be unequally yoked with an unbeliever thing. I mean, we have a great relationship, and honestly, it only gets better with time. So knock on wood, let's hope that keeps going. And I hope all of you also have lovely relationships as well. But I am going to have some time this weekend because my wife has to go back home for I don't know if it's a bachelorette weekend or something's going on for one of her good friends. So she's going home, and I am going to be here chilling like a villain on penicillin. And so what I'll do is I will take a look at Derek's straw man video, and I will offer up some of my colorful commentary, and we'll see where it goes. So look out for that. What I wanted to do today very briefly is I wanted to talk about the letter that Paul wrote to the Colossians. Now, guys like Derek and Valiant and a lot of other scholars actually do believe that Paul's letters are pretty authentic. Like there's something going on there. These were literal letters written, right? And I'm pretty positive that Colossians is one of them, but that's besides the point. I don't really base my understanding and my interpretation methods upon what guys say, okay? I base it upon what the story says, all right? Now, Paul, in the letter to the Galatians, writes a bunch of things, and he talks mainly about the law and their violations of that law. And, now mainstream Christianity and the traditional view would have you believe that these are pagans. These are people who were not related to the covenant of Israel. They were just living out in Colossae. They were just kind of chilling, had no clue about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And suddenly this gospel message comes out to them saying, hey, all those handwritten requirements of the law that were against you, Mr. Colossian, they've been forgiven. And so the Colossian, not having a clue what a handwritten requirement of the Mosaic law is, would probably scratch his head and say, what does that even mean? Right? But that's the view. I mean, that's what seems to make sense to these guys because they've taken the narcissistic approach and it's me whenever they open the Bible. All right? So let's think about this for a minute. If we do a little connect the dots, okay, and I know Derek and guys like that hate connect the dots. They don't like connecting the dots because if you connect the dots, it's less views for Myth Vision. No, I'm just kidding. But what we're going to do is we're going to connect the dots. Okay, Paul. Well, let's start with Peter. Peter, in his epistle, writes to the elect of the dispersion, spread abroad in Pontus, Galatia, Asia, Cappadocia, Bithynia, elect according to the foreknowledge of God. So Peter's writing to elect individuals. Now we know where elect comes from. It's a term only given to Israel, so that's going to be the same. But we know that he's writing to elect individuals in Asia, right? In Asia. Now, we also know that in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter says that Paul also wrote to this same group of people in all of his epistles, speaking in his epistles of these things, said Peter in 2 Peter 3. So we have confirmation that Paul wrote his epistles to the same audience that Peter wrote his epistle to, that being the elect of the dispersion in the nations. Okay, now, here's where it gets interesting. Colossae, okay, was located in Asia, right? Remember, Peter addresses his letter to the elect in Asia. Peter also says that Paul also wrote to the elect in Asia. I contend that they're both writing to the same people in Asia, that being the elect Israelites. But Colossae is located roughly 15 kilometers southwest, I think that's right, southwest, or was located 15 kilometers southwest of a little place called Laodicea. Now, you all know what Laodicea comes from, right? Or where that comes from. It's Revelation chapter 3, when John is writing his letter to the 7 churches of Asia. Okay, so Colossae was 15 kilometers, which is about 9 miles. Very, very close. You could almost throw a rock and hit it. 9 miles away from Laodicea, which was in Asia, obviously, and so is Colossae. So my point in mentioning these things is that here you have Peter saying that he's writing to the elect Israelites in Asia. Here you have Peter saying that Paul also wrote to the elect Israelites in Asia. 2 Peter chapter 3. So when we go over to Paul's letter to the Colossians, let's just test that theory and see how it works. Colossians chapter 2, verse 11 says this: "In him you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you also were raised with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead." Now here it is. Check this out. "And you, Colossian, being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, having forgiven you all these trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us. He has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross." Ooh, boy, does that pack a mean punch. Okay, now let's analyze this just a tatarooski, shall we? So we know that, from what I just said, there were Israelites in Asia. We know that Laodicea was in Asia, and Laodicea was only 9 miles from Colossae. We know that Peter says that Paul wrote to Israelites in Asia in all of his epistles. So is Paul writing to the Israelites here in Colossae? Well, I think he is. Look at what he says. Okay, first off, he refers to the old body, right? That dead body in the flesh, which is Adam. They were in Adam. They were under the law. That's what I believe Adam sort of represents, is being under the law, being in that, sin system, that imputated sin system. Okay, and then look what it says. He says, "And you, being dead in your trespasses." Now, first of all, in order to be dead in trespasses, you would first have to have a law that you're violating, right? The notion of being dead in trespasses means that you are so far buried in trespasses. You have just basically said, the hell with it. I ain't abiding by this law anymore. You threw everything out the window. You moved somewhere else, and you started a new life totally apart from the commandments of the law. That's what being dead in trespasses and sins actually means. It's not as though these people were, they messed up or slipped up in one little point. No, they were dead in trespasses. They were buried in trespasses. They were so far outside of the commonwealth of Israel that your head would spin. Okay, this is what Paul refers to in Romans 2 when he says that there's Gentiles who sometimes do the things commanded in the law of Moses and thereby show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, which either accuses them or excuses them in the day of Christ or in the day of judgment. So here's the same concept of these Israelites being so far dead in trespasses and sins. And look what else Paul tells them. They're also dead in. They're dead in the uncircumcision of their flesh. That means that they weren't circumcised. Now, being circumcised was a commandment, was it not? So, not being circumcised would be a trespass if you fall within the covenant boundaries, right? If the book of the Maccabees is actually true, then, or it actually documents the couple hundred years leading up to Christ, then we have a perfect correlation. We have the book of the Maccabees documenting Israelites leaving the law, leaving the covenant, abandoning circumcision, actually reversing their circumcision. Ouchie, right? Ouchie. Okay? So the point here is that we have proof that this could have very well been exactly what I say it is. A letter written to the Israelites in Colossae, because we know that they were scattered far and wide. We know that a couple hundred years before that they started to leave the covenant. We know that we have exact words that say that they stopped circumcising and that they were reversing their circumcision. And here comes Paul saying, hey, you're dead in trespasses and you're dead in the uncircumcision of your flesh. Now, if that doesn't sound like an Israelite who has walked away from the law, I don't know what does. But look what else he says. He says, he has made alive together, having forgiven you all of these trespasses, and having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us. He has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. So let me ask you a question. Where in the Bible, Old Testament or New, do we ever see God declaring his commandments and laws to non-covenant people? In fact, we have quite the opposite. We have the repeated mentionings that this law was only for Israel. Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 7, Psalm 147, Romans 9. I mean, it goes on and on. The book of Ezra. We could quote hundreds of passages just from the Torah. The point is that God wasn't declaring his laws to anyone other than his covenant people. Right? And so it goes back to that whole, without law, there's no imputation of sin. So the ones who were being held to a higher standard were the Israelites, because they had the responsibility of maintaining this system that was being entrusted to them. Deuteronomy words it as, or Moses tells them that people would look upon them and say, wow, what a wise and understanding people who have this law. So these people who had this law were going to be a unique, a very peculiar people, okay? The chosen people, the ones that Moses said God loved high above all else. The ones that the Old Testament calls God's portion and God's inheritance. Imagine that. God's portion and God's inheritance. Well, isn't that the same thing that Paul says in Ephesians 1, where he says, the Holy Spirit is given as a deposit until, what does it say? Until the inheritance of the possession or something like that. So the point is that this was obviously all about Israel. Okay, it makes no sense for Paul to tell the Colossians that handwritten requirements were against them and were imputing sin against them if they were true pagans. Pagans never had handwritten requirements. Pagans never had the law against them. That's just not in the story. That's your own imaginary made-up nonsense that you've been spoon-fed from the beginning. Whether it be for controlling purposes or just sheer ignorance, I don't know. There's probably a whole mixture of reasons. But that is the truth. There is nothing in the Bible that includes anyone else under the law that is spoken of, that condemns, that imputes. There's nothing. Okay? And someone might say, well, Paul was writing to Jews in Colossae. That's why he tells them that. Well, no. Boneheads. Paul wasn't writing just to Jews in Colossae. Paul had a mixed bag o' nuts everywhere he wrote to. And if you notice, Paul tells these specific ones in Colossae that they were dead in trespasses and the uncircumcision of their flesh. Does that sound like a Jew? Does that sound like a Jew to you? The uncircumcision of a Jew's flesh? That doesn't sound like a Jew. That sounds like a lost, scattered Israelite. Okay? And that actually matches what Paul tells the Ephesians when he says that they were once Gentile in the flesh, but had now been made near to Christ through his blood. In other words, they were once uncircumcised in the Wiener Schnitzel. They were like the Gentiles in the flesh of the foreskin, which they shouldn't have been. Okay, that's his whole point. You are alienated from the commonwealth of Israel. You're strangers to the covenant. In other words, you're far out here. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're Gentile in the flesh. You're not circumcised. What are you doing? You're dead in trespasses and sins. But wait. Christ, through his blood, has nailed these requirements to the cross. He has abolished the law in his flesh. He has abolished the enmity in his flesh, that being the law, Paul says. And he has made both men one. Both parties one. You who are afar off and those who are near. He came and preached peace to those who are afar off and those who are near. Those are a part of the Israel narrative. Far off and near. Okay? So, this is very easy to see if you just open up your good eye. Alright? I know you got a crusty eye, but if you open up your good eye, you can see it. Because it's all about Israel. And it only makes sense if it's all about Israel. Like I always say, a ministry of reconciliation makes absolutely no sense with pagans, because pagans never needed to be reconciled because they never had a relationship with this God in the first place. The prodigal son puts it all into perspective. The good son stays home with Papa Goad, who is the father. The bad son runs off to the nations. Later on, the bad son comes back to Papa Goad from the nations, and Papa Goad Goad is Matthew Simon's way of saying God. Papa Goad actually hugs that bad son and welcomes him back into his arms. The entire story screams Israel only. Anyways, folks, that's all I got to say. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you all have a great day. And we'll catch you on that flippity. Don't forget to give it a like, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.